Hello and welcome to Veritas Voices. Today, Rene and myself will be discussing Bible contradictions. I'm sure you've never heard of any of them before. But truly, we'll be looking at the contradictions themselves as well as some common responses and, frankly, excuses, and seeing what we can make of the Christian's response to pointing out these contradictions. Have you encountered a lot of these in conversation, Rene?
Well, it's typically something which you encounter all of the time when Christians post a message pretty much calling us out for, let's show me some Bible contradictions because my book is totally infallible and there aren't any contradictions. And then in the comment section, you see pretty much atheists just quoting verses all over the place. But
it reminds me of that one, it's a meme and just an exchange, Christian, the Bible says peace on earth, or Jesus says peace on earth, and the atheist says, actually, Jesus said, I did not come to bring peace on earth, but a sword. And the Christian is like, you're taking it out of context. So it's that same thing where the more you show about the context of what's being said, the more you're somehow ignoring the context, which of course, in their minds, the context is the one in which they are right. One of the weird things I remember from being a Christian and from, facing some of these contradictions was you didn't have to find evidence for your justifications. You just had to come up with a plausible justification. And if it included some historical facts, you should probably find someone to corroborate, but it was totally fine to look for someone who agreed with you and find what they said. You didn't have to actually assess the claim and try and disprove it. And I realize now how very, very bad an epistemology that is. But I was trained to do that. And I wonder what you've observed with regard to that in your interactions with believers.
I mean, one thing which I've interacted with in the last few days, because there was, in my life at least, a big conversation about one contradictions that they do not really seek to understand what the author specifically intended to say or what it really means or what the Bible really says on the matter. What they seek to do is to reconcile the contradiction that is quite literally there. They do not seek to really do sound exegesis, but to reconcile what we find to be contradictory. And I think that is a very false approach concerning this tactic, but I think that
it's very dishonest, but when you're that motivated to preserve it.
Yeah.
I will say, sorry, go ahead.
I think that is a very consistent theme with Bible contradictions or with how Christian apologetics works, but I think that is also something that we will discuss once we get into the meat of the argument and once we actually pull out our Bible, so to speak.
True enough. And I will say that some people deal with these things differently. There's a verse in, I think, Jeremiah that says the prophecy is subject to the spirit of the prophet. So some people think the Bible is literally inerrant. Every word of it is true. Even when they're directly in contradiction, they're not, because it isn't, because it's not. However, there are some people who are a little more reasonable and say, okay, the Bible was written by humans, so, there will be some different humans too. So there will be some minor, jostling, I guess you could say, from a literary standpoint, but it's still inspired of God. Though they can never tell us in what way it is inspired, which Shakespeare is not. Shakespeare is apparently a much better author than God. I don't think that was a good choice on God's part, but hey, Apparently, that's just beyond my wisdom.
I think you brought up a really great point, which I want to sort of bring up before we actually get into the verses, is that Bible contradictions in and of themselves do not contradict or do not disprove the Christian faith. Christianity could still be true, but the Bible could still have some contradictions inside it.
Yes.
There's nothing inherently about the Bible not being perfect which would disprove Christianity, but in biblical inerrancy is sort of an axiomatic dogma that is important within fundamentalism, and I think that is
it's
something
an untenable
that is untenable.
position. Yeah.
That is untenable, and I think that is where we have to point out what we will discuss right now. So I would suggest that we start in with sort of the first verse and the first contradictions which we want to discuss. What do you have in mind?
Sounds good. Well, I was just going to say, to your point, yes, the contradictions, minor contradictions would not necessarily disprove Christianity, but it depends the type of contradictions, it depends where they are and what they mean. When you have something that's theologically significant and two diametrically opposed perspectives on it in the same Bible, that is problematic. And so that's actually one of the first ones we wanted to discuss, because of course, the whole idea of the Gospels is to have 4 witnesses or stories about Jesus to, create a more complete narrative. Do you want to introduce the first one?
Okay, so the first passages we wanted to discuss for today was Mark chapter 16, verses 7 through 8, in comparison to Matthew chapter 28, verse 8.
And this is right at the end of Mark, end of Matthew, and deals with basically the resurrection morning. In the original manuscripts, there was nothing past verse 8 in Mark 16. But basically it covers the women coming to the tomb, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, Salome, bringing the spices to anoint the body and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I would just suggest, for the benefit of our listeners or of yours, that we were to just read them out right now.
Okay, well, I'll just read from 5 then, for a little bit of context. Mark 16, verses 5 to 8. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where he laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So this leaves the story in a bit of a bind, because the women apparently didn't tell anyone.
Yeah, and this stands in dark contradiction with Matthew chapter 28, verse 8, where it says, "So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and went to tell his disciples."
True, because in the first one, they were told to tell the disciples. In the second, but they didn't. And in the second one, it explicitly says that they did. Now, there's much made about the idea of eyewitnesses to the resurrection, or at least to the post-death appearances soon after the resurrection. It would be really good to know if the people who apparently saw the angel said anything about it or not. That seems like a good point to be clear on. And all the versions that are compiled that I've seen have the women telling the disciples in a bit of a panic, even though Mark is, by all scholars, considered to be the earlier one, and therefore, if there was any accuracy in them, it would more likely be accurate.
And one thing which I've heard in the last few days, the way it is reconciled is that what I've heard is that they fled from the tomb and they didn't tell anyone, but the not telling anyone was referring to them going on their way to the other disciples, where they then told Peter and the disciples. So they didn't tell anyone on the way to the disciples, where they then told someone.
Well,
But that
that's
doesn't
not
work.
flailing and desperate. So if I'm panicking and running to tell Joe, I didn't tell anybody if I don't stop and grab some random schmuck on the road in a panicked, hysterical fit and tell them that I saw an angel. That means I didn't tell anybody if I don't do that. Okay, that's logical.
I mean, the really big problem I see with that is the way that we use language. I mean, they are pretty much instructed first to tell Peter and the disciples and to go into Galilee and to tell them. That was the instruction that they were given by this being in the white cloak, so to speak. But immediately after that, then it tells us that they were bewildered and they fled and they did not tell anyone. So pretty much what is implicitly said, or what is implied within the verse, is that they directly then went against instruction. That is pretty much the only context which makes sense, and that is what you can get as the intention of the author.
Well, and it's possible that because
correct.
they know that verses 9 to 19 were added later, there are 9 to 20, they were not included in the original manuscripts. It's possible that that was an attempt at resolution, because then you have Mary Magdalene wandering on her own, mourning and all confused, and then Jesus meets her and says, you know, it's me, and she's all overjoyed, and then she goes and tells everybody. And that, yeah, like that seems like a fix-it, like tacked on to the end of Mark to make it line up with Matthew, or at the very least to, you know, make it less confusing and just drop out from under you. But of course, that would mean that, you know, people thought about and tried to edit what they were writing over time, and God didn't just dictate it into their ear like they were some kind of divine stenographers. This is actually something that was taught by Jerry Falwell. Like God was using them like typewriters or something. I don't know.
I mean, I would say that the sort of additional passages 9 to 20 don't really fit together with the previous verses of Mark.
Well, no, and they are known to be a later addition, but yeah. I think that might have been the reason for them to be added. It would at least, it's a sort of an attempt at a fix-it.
As is pretty much the apologetic or the interpretation, let's say, or the exegesis which announces employ. But the big problem, which we have already addressed, is that these people do not seek to understand the intention of the author when he quite clearly says, well, they were instructed to tell the disciples. They were bewildered and they did not tell anyone. The intention of the author is quite literally that they did not tell anyone because they were so bewildered. But yeah, what apologists seek to do is they do not seek to get the intention of the author or to understand the intention of the author, but to reconcile it with what the other Gospels say on the matter, which is problematic in my view.
That's the problem. When you're trying to say that everything in the Bible is fundamentally true, you have to do a lot of very interesting mental gymnastics. And we've been talking about some of the justifications that are made, and we were talking about, also related to the crucifixion, the death of Judas. I believe the one account is in Matthew 27, 1 to 10, where, well, maybe I can slim down a little bit. Right. So he goes to the priests and he's all very upset. So starting at verse 5. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left, and then went away and hanged himself. And the chief priest picked up the coins and said, "It's against the law to put this into the treasury since it's blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. So you have Judas being regretful. This didn't turn out the way he expected, panics, throws the money at them, goes and kills himself. And that is more or less the version that is usually portrayed in The Passion of the Christ. If you've ever had the misfortune to sit through that particular bit of torture porn, he does go and hang himself.
Well, unfortunately, I did not, but I was wondering what particular verses or where there would be a different portrayal of that scenario.
Well, the other one is in Acts. Acts and Luke were written by the same author. So this is a continuation of the story from the first book, and it ends with a little bit of overlap there. And in Acts 1, I think it's Acts 1, 18 and 19. Yeah, it's a quick sort of a aside thrown in brackets in explaining in the narrative how they had to replace him as a disciple with Matthias. And it said, "With the reward he got for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong, his body burst open, and his intestines spilled out." Lovely imagery. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, so they called the field in their language Akaldama, that is, the field of blood. Now, I have to say, the differences here are interesting, but what's really telling are the similarities. You have two claims of the field of blood, called the field of blood to this day, which, of course, denotes that a certain amount of time has passed. And you have two different stories centered around the same figure as to how that field got its name. Usually the apologists will stitch them together and say Judas hanged himself and then his guts spilled open. They don't really explain how he could have fell headlong with his head tied to a tree. That's not even a position I'm going to attempt. But the one part they never try and reconcile, and they always try and deflect from having to reconcile by going back to the whole hanged himself, spilled open guts thing, is who bought the field.
I mean, I think that is pretty much where they would appeal to ignorance and say, well, we don't know, but somebody would have bought the field, and there's totally not a contradiction. So we will have
one,
to
the
have to live
priests
with
bought
that.
the field with the money, and the other, Judas, bought the field with the money. Same money, same field, different purchasers, and quite a different motivation on Judas's part. Either he freaked out and regretted what he did, or he didn't. That's, pretty significant to a character. If that were part of the story of my life, it would be something I'd want to be very clear on.
I mean, that is pretty much also one thing which I frequently encounter. Whenever there's a sort of theological trap where there's quite clearly a contradiction and where there is a hole to fill for it to be reconciled, they will just either throw up their arms or claim ignorance, or it does make sense.
Or deflect,
the way they try to reconcile it, but reconcile it they will. They're ready, willing, and able to reconcile it somehow in order to just not admit that there's an issue.
True. And there's a lot of defensiveness around it. I did actually uncover some of these when I was a Christian. And, there would be an explanation focused on, but it would never really cover all of the problems. But you just sort of focused on the parts that did work, and then tried to make that be enough. And honestly, it's a dreadful way to live. I don't like dishonesty. It's very hard to be a Christian and to pay attention if you don't like dishonesty. But there was another one we had discussed that was more of a theological point, focusing on the nature of God. And this one, although a little more esoteric, is, in my opinion, a bit more problematic. Because in 1 John 4, verse 16, it says that God is love. And so we know and rely on the love God has for us, because God is love, and whoever lives in love lives in God and God in him.
Actually, a slight correction. The verse we're looking for right now is 1 John 4:8. It is there it says, "Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love."
Ah, yes.
And this stands in direct contradiction with 1 Corinthians verse 13 to 47. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. So that is also the nature of love, which is portrayed in 1 Corinthians, right? So,
but that's not the nature of God that's portrayed, and that's the problem, because the chapter 13 is a really good portrayal of love.
Yeah. So the argument goes in 1 John 8 it says God is love. In 1 Corinthians it says love does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, and there is laid out the nature of love. But then in Exodus 25 we are told that you shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, and you shall not bow to them or worship them. The them referred then would be other gods or other idols. And yes, God is jealous of those other idols.
He is. And, you know, in the theological discussions, they try to say that worshiping other gods is like cheating on God. Like if you were married and you cheated with someone else, and your spouse would be right to be upset about that. But there are a lot of occasions where he seems to be preemptively getting quite angry, just at the idea that someone might, at some future time, do something he doesn't like. And in that exact place where it talks about being a jealous God, he says, visiting the sins of the fathers upon the sons to the third and fourth generations of them that hate me, but showing love unto 1,000 generations of them that love me and are called by my name. Even though in the law itself, it says that it's wrong to punish the child for the sins of the parents, or the parents for the sins of the child. Everyone should bear their own guilt. So it seems that the standard applied to us has no bearing whatsoever on the standard applied to God and what we would call his behaviors and actions, at least theologically speaking.
Yeah, I mean, this is, well, not really a directly laid out contradiction. It is definitely an implicit one, because God does not adhere to his own standards, because according to Christian theology, the sins of the father definitely have to be paid off by the sons. I mean, that is pretty much Christianity 1.0. We are punished for what Adam did, even thousands of generations later.
Oh yeah, the ancestral sin, whether of a literal Adam or some manner of metaphor for the fall, either way, we are held accountable by a representative that, frankly, I did not vote for. I did not vote for Adam as a representative. I think we need a campaign, no damnation without representation. If it worked for America and taxation, I think it should work for us.
Yeah, and that is pretty much where God would apply a double standard, because for humans, it is not just to have children have to pay for the sins that the father committed, but as far as God goes, yeah, that's perfectly fine. No
And
big deal.
don't even get me into, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but perfect love casts out fear. Those are another two verses that people often bring up with relation to the love of God. And I can tell you, a lot of faith involves cultivating very specific kinds of fear of God, and it's not a good thing.
But I would also like to get, since I think we got a little bit sidetracked, get back to sort of the argument which we were to lay out within the three verses which we were to bring up. So in 1 John 8 it says, God is love. In Exodus 25 it says, God is not jealous. Or in
That God is jealous.
in Exodus 25 it says God is jealous, but in 1 Corinthians 13:47 says that love is not jealous. And there are ways Christians seek to reconcile that, but I don't think those really succeed.
No, well, largely in cases like that, as with the matter of fear, it becomes a higher mystery to, hold these two things in a balance of yada, yada, yada. It's meant to be very deep and a sign of spiritual maturity to find a way to reconcile them in action, if not necessarily in thought. And I mean, it keeps people invested trying to reach some kind of understanding that makes a contradiction not a contradiction. But I think it's an incredibly toxic form of so-called love. But before I get maudlin, I wanted to go on to the next one that we discussed, because this is, sorry.
I would like to say one final thing concerning the last one, because the way that Christians, which I've heard seek to reconcile that, is that they draw a distinction between sort of the jealousy that God has and other forms of jealousy, and they would say that the jealousy that God has would be righteous jealousy because he is jealous of us worshipping other gods, while our turns and our worship of him rightfully belongs to him. So therefore his jealousy is fully righteous, while other forms of jealousy are in another sense not righteous or unrighteous, and so that would be reconciled. But what I would say to that is that within 1 Corinthians 13:47 there is no such indication that there's a distinction to be made. That is purely ad hoc on the part of the Christian. And I also think that there are other cases of God being jealous which do not necessarily involve adherence to what belongs to him, or
Yeah.
you know what I mean.
No, I know what you mean. And it's honestly, it's a very toxic concept to keep you in that sort of suspended animation between these two ideas, constantly working to reconcile them. But it, like I said, it keeps people invested in the faith. But that's the thing. The story about Jesus is, it has its good angles and it has its bad angles. And there's a lot of mess between them. But one that's often pointed out that I know we wanted to touch on were the two different genealogies in Matthew and Luke. And I wanted to tell the story of that for me because the one in Luke is a bit odd, honestly. It comes in I think it's the 3rd chapter, and it's backwards. Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Mathat, the son of, it counts backward from Jesus instead of forward from Adam, the way that the Matthew genealogy does. But the conventional response has been, for the longest time, that Matthew's genealogy refers to Joseph and Luke's genealogy refers to Mary. And when I heard this, I went and actually looked, silly me. And I brought this up to my mother and I said, they're both the genealogies of Joseph. And she said, well, no, the one in Luke is the one about Mary. And I said, no, it doesn't say that. It says Joseph. I just read it. And so she looked at me and said, well, we just have to have faith then. And that was the response, the only response she had in that moment. And I found it very unsatisfying, but in retrospect, I also find it very telling.
I mean, for sake of reference, what would be the specific verses concerning this problematic?
Well, Matthew's genealogy runs Matthew 1, 1 to 17. It's right at the front. Luke's genealogy runs, well, it's kind of buried. Chapter 3, verses 23 to 38. And there's a couple of differences that are quite interesting. The first chunk, or the last chunk, the earliest chunk, if you were going, the idea of Adam and Seth and Enosh and going up to David is the same, pretty much the same. There's a couple of missing names in Matthew, I think, but it's the same basic trace of lineage. And then they follow from a son of David, and it's completely different. Matthew just follows the king list, going through Solomon, Rehoboam, yada, 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 until Josiah at the time of the exile to Babylon. Luke has an entirely different list coming from David. Actually trying to find it here. Yeah, Nathan, through his son Nathan. I mean, and, you know, David is supposed to have had so many wives and so many sons. Now, it's conceivable that you could end up with two branches of the family tree meeting again at some point, but that's never clearly indicated. And the very end of it traces, you know, from Levi to Mathat to Heli to Joseph to Jesus, even though apparently had nothing to do with it. And there's a similar name in Matthew, Eleazar to Matan, the father of Jacob, the father of Joseph. So, yeah, there's very little overlap aside from the mythical characters from Adam to David. They all line up perfectly. Funny that.
I mean, obviously, the characters from Adam to David would line up perfectly because there the genealogy is pretty much perfectly laid out. I mean, we have sort of a complete list from Adam to Noah in a sense, and also it's not really hard to get from Noah to David, but I think that actually would be a contradiction which would have significant implications for Jesus as a person and Jesus as a Messiah.
Right.
At least in my view.
No, I think you're right. In my mind, I reconciled it as the king list being the proper line of descent, which doesn't necessarily always go father to son, because you might not have a son and then it goes to a cousin or something. And the other is being the actual biological line. That was a hypothesis I came up with in my head. Nothing to support it, but it comforted me because it seemed to make sense. But the really funny thing I found out is that in medieval times, they also agreed there was no contradiction and that they were both the record of Joseph, that basically that Mathat and Matan are basically the same, which is conceivable, that he had two sons, Jacob and Heli, who both married the same woman who died, and they couldn't tell who Joseph belonged to. Sort of, he was attributed to both. I mean, that doesn't make sense of the rest of the mess of the genealogy, but it's rather odd. It's a rather interesting attempt to fix it. There was one version that involved two different times where two brothers marry the same woman in sequence. One of them dies and then the other marries her. And then they, have two sons, and then one of them dies and the other marries his brother's widow. So I do understand this was a practice of caring for widows in Judaism, but I do have to wonder where they came up with this story and how they managed to, how far back they tried to overlay that over the mess, because yeah, it's a little far-fetched.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much one hypothesis which narratists or fundamentalists cannot obviously concede is that it is a mess because humans are fallible and because genealogies are complicated and mistakes are bound to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So from a human perspective, from my perspective, I would see it as perfectly normal that humans could get confused with genealogies and with all these names. It's not a big deal. It's perfectly expected, it's conceivable, but obviously it does have implications if you think that there are no mistakes, there cannot be mistakes, it's 100% inspired and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's untenable. And quite frankly, most of these names were obviously made up. I know they liked to keep records, but there's no way they had these records after the exile to Babylon. And Matthew at least was clearly just copying the king's list. So that's the other thing. A lot of people will pretend that Luke was a great historian because he cribbed some historical stuff from Josephus. But he wasn't. A great historian, even a moderately competent historian, would have given a source for the genealogy. Just anything. There's no way you have, 50 generations of a genealogy without any written records, and it's right, or even remotely plausible that you know what you're talking about. It's just not feasible.
Even if you were to look at Paul, he also said that where he got his information from, he said that in this case it was divine revelation, and he explicitly rejected the notion that he got it from any other source, but I think it's pretty much common courtesy that you would cite your sources. So, and great historians, even back in the day, would do that. So I think it is a fairly reasonable expectation that if Luke was an intellectually honest person who wanted to write a historical document instead of a theological one, that he would give us some information about that.
Yes, there would have been at least something. When Josephus says, and then you can check this in the record of such and such, even if you don't find that to be a reliable source, there's at least a source. It's something. He didn't just pull it out of his backside. Now, do you want to bring up the next contradiction?
Well, I think another good contradiction, though it is sort of implicit, but it's also, I think, a good one because it is one that directly touches the heart of Christianity, or is directly impacting Christianity or the nature of God, would be what it says within Hebrews 6 verse 18, and implicitly this is contradicted by 2 Thessalonians verses 9 to 12.
Yes, 2 Thessalonians. Yeah, I have to love that they gave them the names of weird cities. Half the Bible book names are just weird. Sorry, I'm just trying to find Thessalonians. I made a note in my Bible, actually, which of the books of the New Testament were considered authentic. aside from the Gospels, we don't know who wrote any of those, but the letters, the epistles actually do have authors usually ascribed to them. And Second
Okay.
Thessalonians is, well.
Okay, so the verses in question are Second Thessalonians 2, 9-12, and Hebrews chapter 6, verse 18. So while you're searching for
No, I've got it.
Thessalonians.
Go
Okay,
ahead.
so in Hebrews 6, verse 18, it says, God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. The key takeaway from this verse is that God cannot lie. It is impossible for God to lie. It is not within his nature that he can lie. So what would it say concerning this within Second Thessalonians chapter 2?
Mm-hmm. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9-12. And the coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with the work of Satan displayed in all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs, and wonders, and every sort of evil that deceives those who are perishing. They perish because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion so that they will believe the lie, and so that they will all be condemned, who have not believed the truth but have delighted in wickedness. This is the kind of thing you get where it's like God made you not believe and it's your fault, so it's totally reasonable for you to be punished. No. Yeah. Now, I will say at least that 2 Thessalonians is not considered authentic. But at the same time, there's the same attitude given in the Old Testament when God sends a lying spirit into the mouths of the prophets, prophesying before the king of Israel and Judah, or the kings of Israel and Judah. There's many cases where God causes people to be deceived, but apparently he can't lie. So it's okay if he tells someone else to lie for him or empowers a being to trick people. It's just that he doesn't say the lie himself, so that makes him honest. Because I'm pretty sure that would not stand up in a court of law. I don't know about you.
I would say that one thing which one could bring up is that he is not directly telling a lie within Second Thessalonians, but that he is sort of sending them a delusion and giving them a false impression. But I think that is also not really credible, because if I were to, let's make an analogy, if I take video footage of a person stabbing someone, but this fake video footage, no one really died, but I portrayed it in the sense that someone really was killed, then I would be lying to you, even though I wouldn't have told you anything. I can still lie to you by conveying false messages via videos or via giving you false information of any sort.
Absolutely. Well, and pretending that that's somehow less deceptive is frankly ridiculous. It's a pretty desperate justification. But you see the same kind of thing when we say, faith isn't evidence. And they say, well, faith is the evidence of things hoped for, or the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And we say, see, it is what you have when you don't have evidence. Like, oh no, we have evidence, we just can't see it, as though seeing was the only, seeing directly with our own eyes was the only type of evidence that we would accept. And I've had Christians maintain that position while I was saying, no, I don't need to see God to have evidence of God. I can't see the Higgs boson. I can't see quantum mechanics. What I can see is my iPhone, which works because of quantum mechanics. And that, is, I see that every day. But it's there's a degree of inference there, and I'm okay with that, just, but they just keep pretending that I said the thing that I didn't say. So it drives me a little bit crazy. What can I say?
I mean, I would say concerning this as a side note is that God definitely is a scientific hypothesis, because the hypothesis that God exists has scientific predictions, but that is as a side note, and I think that is worth talking about in a separate hangout. But I would say that lying definitely has two components, which is one, that it's deceitful, that you have an intent to deceive, and two, that it's false information.
Yeah.
For instance, if I encounter a small child and it tells me that I hope that the child hopes that I was good this year, otherwise I will get coal in my stockings from Santa, then that child is not lying to me, because the child definitely believes in Santa and it does so truthfully, and it has no intent to deceive me. But the intent to deceive is the real important aspect, and I think within various verses within the Bible, it is definitely portrayed that God has an intent to deceive people.
It does.
And whether it does so by giving us hallucinations, by deliberately giving us false informations, which I also think is the case within the Bible, but that's another thing.
Oh, I know. Well, we could do a whole show on that, probably several. But, it's true that the thing of it being inaccurate information, it honestly reminds me of Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, where at the end of the play, the main character, who has been lying that he has a brother and that his name is Ernest to sort of get out of social obligations and go back and forth between the city and the country, finds out that he was actually christened Ernest and his friend actually is his little brother. So he goes, "It's a horrible thing to find out you've been telling the truth your entire life." And it's, and then his fiance says, "Oh, I can forgive you. I'm certain you will change." Because that's Oscar Wilde. But it's that same thing where, so much misinformation and so many intents to deceive. But then people are sometimes deceiving themselves. And where you draw the line on responsibility with that is difficult.
I think the important part to take away from this is one can go the route of insisting that lying is explicitly about telling a lie, about saying it with your own voice, and in that sense, God would not lie because he does not directly communicate with us. But this would be splitting hair concerning other things where he is deliberately giving us false information, which is explicitly said in the Bible, which is implicit in the Bible, and many other things. So I think that it is definitely a contradiction. It is not in line with Hebrews 6 verse 18, and it is something that, at the very least, if Christians, or if biblical narratists, I should say, do try to reconcile with just making up excuses, it should at the very least be something for them to think about.
It should. And yeah, I mean, like I said, I've heard a lot of interesting excuses made up in my time, often about Old Testament contradictions just with pure numbers. Kent Hovind had a routine he used to do with that where he invented an entire army methodology with soldiers trading out chariots when they got tired to account for two radically different numbers of horses, men, and chariots that were given for the same battle. So, yeah, but it's an attitude that I never realized how prevalent and pervasive and wrong it was until I became an atheist. And there's the one time my dad was telling me about the changes in belief that he's experienced in the last several years, including abandoning the belief in hell, which I'm very grateful for. But he said, I know this and I know that. And it drove me a little bit crazy. So I said, Dad, how do you know? And he's like, what do you mean? So I said, okay, your version of God is much, much more ethical than most versions of God I've heard. I'm not arguing that. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. What I'm saying is, what is your evidence that your idea, your very nice, very positive idea, is actually accurate? And I had to lay it out that specifically for him. And he said, I don't know. I'll get back to you. He hasn't yet. And I think he's not trying to be dishonest about it. But it wasn't until that moment that I realized how foreign that entire concept was of saying, okay, this is your idea. Now demonstrate how it is accurate.
I think that is a really important point to bring up, and I think that is the fundamental difference between the two camps, because I would never confidently assert something which I absolutely do not know to be true. When I say I don't know, and I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
But Christians are, as I said, ready, willing, and able to reconcile the verses however they can, not in an attempt to find truth, not in an attempt to get the intention of the author, not in an attempt to seek whether there are actually contradictions, but in an attempt to tell themselves that there are not contradictions in order to make sure that they can go on believing that there aren't any.
Yeah. And basically it comes down to believing that their faith is not in vain. When you've invested so much in something, it's hard to face the idea that you might be wrong. So as hard as that is, it's a very difficult thing, but it's also a very important thing to do. And it takes courage to look and say, I think I've invested a lot of time in something that isn't right, isn't true, isn't real. It was a hard thing for me to do. It's a hard thing for anyone to do. But it's the right thing to do because it's the honest thing to do. So I think that about wraps it up. I mean, obviously there are more contradictions. There's an entire website devoted to the massive network of Bible contradictions, which I can include in the description. It's just insanity. But I hope that focusing on some of the New Testament ones and ones around Jesus helps explain why atheists are hesitant to accept the claims of Christians, if nothing else. So get a hold of us on Twitter. Our handles will be in the description below. And reason bless. Have a wonderful day.
Have a great day, everyone.
Goodbye.